Greetings and welcome to Theology Thursdays. We continue with N.T. Wright's book Surprised by Hope with Chapter 4. Now, Chapter 4 is going to begin to deal with a different kind of way of knowing things. So in Chapter 3, Wright begins to outline the theological argument for epistemic reliability. Now, those are a bunch of very large words, and I imagine some of your eyes kind of glazed over at that. Let's just remind ourselves as to what we mean by that. So, epistemology is simply the study of how we know what we know. We are trying to put forth the kinds of evidences that we know are reliable. And when we start doing that, what we have to do is establish parameters. What types of ways of knowing do we treat as being admissible for evidence? What types of evidence do we not admit on the basis of our criteria? Well, Chapter 3 was theological epistemology, where we talk about what did the resurrection mean theologically for the time period of which it is talked about. First century Judea, specific point in time, specific kind of culture, and specific kind of theology that we're dealing with. Now in Chapter 4, Wright is going to be shifting the discussion to historical accuracy, historical reasoning. And when he does this, what he is going to be having to do is shift a little bit of the playing field as to our epistemic question. How do we know what we know, and how do we know it reliably? Instead of asking the theological question, which has to do with philosophy, things like that, of what exactly did the first century community in the Judea and wider region think about the concept of resurrection, now we have to actually ask ourselves about a specific historical happening. And it is none other than the resurrection itself. If you remember from last chapter, one of the weird things about the Christian confession in the first century is that it bifurcated the general belief in the resurrection at the end of the age into two different ages, because they believed that there was an anastasis that happened in time, which was inconceivable to even Jesus' closest disciples. And so now we have a different time period we're dealing with. There is an anastasis of a specific person at a specific time in history. And that means we now have to ask the historical question. How can we know reliably that Jesus was raised from the dead? Now, before we start, as you probably can tell by the name of this video, this is part 1 of this chapter. Because for you who might not have necessarily dabbled with historical criticism and things like that, this is going to be a fairly thick chapter. Chapter 4 is either going to be one of your favorite chapters or one of your least favorite chapters, because it has to deal with how we weigh historical evidence, how we weigh narratively the pieces that we're putting together for all these things. To set the background for this, though, we need to recognize a couple of things before we start talking about the historical critical aspect of what we are trying to argue for. First of all, we need to talk about what kinds of evidence do we treat as being reliable when it comes to historical criticism. What are the pieces of evidence that we treat as having some sort of explanatory power? Or, to put it in another way, what is the thing that makes the most sense out of what we have in front of us? When we look historically, it is just the sheer fact that we live at a different point in time in history than the time period in which we are interrogating. And there is also one really, really world-changing aspect that changes the way that we even think fundamentally about evidence. And it is none other than perhaps one of the most important inventions in human history, which is the printing press. We live on this side of the printing press. If you think about this, the printers of the pre-1500s really, in a lot of ways, were monastics sitting at a scriptorum that were handwriting all of the texts that they are receiving, and that they would have to painstakingly do this day in, day out. This was part of people's work that they did. And if you can imagine how slow it is to write something, and if you can imagine how slow it might be in the grand scheme of things to copy edit some other volume in a manner of sitting down and literally looking at the page and writing it as you go along, imagine how much different, both in the efficiency and also in the volume, that a more standardized machined process, such as the printing press, could make books available. There is a really solid argument that there is no small coincidence that the Protestant Reformation took hold as much as it did because Luther lived just on this side of the printing press. Luther was able to publish his arguments in a far more wide setting than was ever able to be done before because of the availability of cheap books and being able to produce it in a way that is accessible to the normal person. But what that does, especially in our modern 21st century, where, I can grab out my cell phone, I can get on the internet and I read text that is specifically on a digital format, not in a paper format. I can read it and access billions, trillions of pages of information, and all of it is immediately accessible. When we start talking about pre-printing press, we run into a very interesting problem, which is that times and cultures operated on a completely different relationship to text than we do in modern day. And therefore, pre-printing press, evidence as it comes to physical hard copy evidence is really, really difficult to find in ways that we can say are either reliable or in ways that we can say are accurate. It is simply a function of the way that history works, is that the farther away that you get from a certain event, the more reliant you are on those who wrote about it in previous days, and you have to discern, as you are perhaps copy editing, from previous writers, what exactly is the truth of the matter. This is one of the reasons why one of the great references in the Renaissance was ad fontes, back to the sources. In other words, we got to go back to the original sources, or at least as close as we can to the original sources, to figure out what exactly happened. This was a fair move, though, because the closer that we get back to original stuff, the more that we can say we can maybe accurately discern the shape of what exactly is going on, if not the exact happening and the exact date of when these things happened. So when we talk about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, very simply, we are talking about an actual historical happening. Christians believe this happened in reality. Christians do not think that this is simply a pie-in-the-sky sort of thing. Rather, Christians have always said, this is a historical happening that can actually be looked back to upon historical evidence. The challenge that we run into when we start getting into that is that we have to discern what types of historical evidence are we admitting, and what types of historical evidence can we say are dubious in value. What we're doing when we start talking about the resurrection in chapter 4 is that we are weighing the sources that we believe are most reliable against what the wider milieu of the first century might say about a certain happening. Take, for example, just as a small example, Caesar crossing the Rubicon. So Caesar, Julius Caesar specifically, crossing the Rubicon River into the city of Rome, is one of the happenings that we would say inaugurates the Empire of Rome. Julius Caesar, in his military escort, becomes the imperator and is received as the imperator when he enters Rome with his military convoy. Now, this particular happening has inspired phrases such as crossing the Rubicon. In other words, you can't go back after you do it. When you do it, you are betting on yourself, so to speak. When you do something, you are crossing the Rubicon. You can't go back from there. Well, the question is, when did this happen, and how can we say accurate that it did happen? Well, to establish this important event of crossing the Rubicon, we have to take into consideration a couple of things. Number one, what kind of textual sources do we have access to? If we don't have physical evidence of the crossing of the Rubicon, how can we establish that it happened at all? Especially when the crossing of the Rubicon is in imperial records and therefore is most likely written by those who were supporters of the empire. As of any political party, you are, especially as an empire, you're not going to have those who are not on your side writing your history. And this inspires, by the way, one of the phrases of history is written by the winners. That's not always the case, but especially when you're dealing with court historians, that's definitely something you have to take in mind and take into account. Josephus, one of the main historians of this time period of who is referred to all the time, Josephus is a court historian for the Roman Empire. So we have to take into account Josephus's own milieu and thinking about what he's writing about. We have to take seriously the conflicts of interest that could be in here that could skew the way that the story is told. The narrative that we are portraying historically has to be interrogated. Now, Wright is also going to say this about the New Testament. If the New Testament is unreliable historically, how can we then say that the resurrection is reliable? If the New Testament is proven to be something that is untrue, especially as it comes to the main point of the New Testament, which is the resurrection of Jesus Christ, how can we say that anything in the rest of the New Testament is true? And likewise, at least for us as Christians, how can we say that this is the Word of God? That's the question we have to have on the table. That's a question that we don't need to shy away from. Because if we really believe that this is a revealed Word of God, we also should have confidence that we would be able, by the way that we interrogate the historical evidence, to be able to say that this is the most likely thing that happened. So what we're doing is we are putting the pieces together in a cumulative fashion. And this is where I want to give you a key word for this. What N.T. Wright is doing is something called a cumulative case argument. A cumulative case argument is an argument that uses multiple disciplines from multiple perspectives, using the most reliable set of methodologies that we believe that we can have in order to test and see whether the evidence that we have that we believe is reliable fits the narrative that we can weave out of that evidence. By the very nature of us doing this, we are making the choice, and this is the scary part of this, we really are making the choice as to which pieces of evidence we believe is reliable. There's no perfect way of doing this. Wright is going to say that directly in this chapter. However, the way in which we have to present the evidence means that we have to do the final judgment on interpretation. Wright, in his cumulative case argument, is going to say, you cannot prove by historical evidence alone that what the New Testament says about the resurrection is true. Now, this is not to say that it isn't true, but you have to be aware that the way that we weigh historical evidence is all about the most likely explanation of what we have in front of us. And there will always be, for time immemorial, ways that you can interpret historical evidence in ways that don't fit what the proper interpretation of those evidences are, and will always be the case. We have to be the final judges of whether this is a reliable argument or not. But what Wright wants to at least put on the table is that this is a coherent argument. In other words, this is an argument that has a level of explanatory power to it. The resurrection of Christ as a real literal event, Wright wants to strongly argue, has coherence to it. It makes sense of what we see historically, and at least in Wright's argument that we're going to weigh right now, it makes the most sense in spite of all the rest of the arguments to the contrary about what happened. And if it is true that Jesus really was resurrected, Wright is going to forcefully say, this changes everything. Jumping right in, how can we say the resurrection of Jesus Christ is something that happened? Well, if you remember in previous chapter, let's go back to Wittgenstein and Popper and that notorious night of argument that involved a fire poker. How can we say what exactly happened when Wittgenstein and Popper got into that argument? Well, there are certain things that are hearsay that we can say may or may not have been the case. Was the poker red hot? Was the poker cold? Did Wittgenstein slam the door on the way out? Did he leave quietly? Those are things that are important that we can talk about. But however, there is no question at all that certain things absolutely happened. It absolutely was the case that Wittgenstein and Popper were in the same room together with a number of witnesses. It is absolutely the case that Popper and Wittgenstein got into a heated argument. It is absolutely the case that a poker was involved with Wittgenstein waving it in the air. It is absolutely the case that Wittgenstein left before Popper was done. We know that these are rock solid what happened because we have eyewitness, we have writings, and we have the men themselves talk about it afterwards. So there are certain things that we can say can be discrepancies that are not essential things. There are two layers to the happening. There are the rock solid things that we know happened, and then there are the surface discrepancies that are things that we can argue about, but that don't take away the fact that this actually happened. Wright says that this is how we have to approach the resurrection of Jesus Christ because of four main reasons. The first of which is a really interesting one, which is that the silence of the Bible about Jesus' resurrection. Now, here's why this is really important. In the four Gospels, we do not have the same story told about Jesus' resurrection. There are definite discrepancies between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John's version of the resurrection. In Matthew's version, you have the angel that thunders from heaven, that rolls away the stone, and the guards at the tomb fall down like dead people. In Luke's version, you have two angels that show up that are dressed in white. In Mark's version, you don't have a reference to an earthquake. In John's version, you don't even have a scene at all. But what you do get in John's gospel is a personal interaction between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. But in the Gospel of St. Mark, and in St. Luke, and in St. Matthew, you have multiple women who go to the tomb who don't meet Jesus at the tomb, who then are commanded by the angel or angels to then go tell the disciples that he has been raised and he's going ahead of you to Galilee. And in one version of the Gospels, the women meet Jesus on the road back. Multiple women meet Jesus on the road back. So how are we to weigh which parts of these stories are true? How many women met Jesus? Did Mary Magdalene have this personal interaction with Jesus where she mistakenly thought he was the gardener? What are we to say when Peter and the beloved disciple get up and run to the tomb and see it as the women say it was, but they don't see the angel? So how are we to describe what exactly happens here? Well, one of the interesting things that in all of these cases is that there are no people who witness the actual resurrection itself, or as Wright will say, the silence about the actual event of the resurrection. And one of the things about the silence about the event of the resurrection is also a key shift in the way that the Gospels themselves talk about Jesus. In the previous parts of the Gospels, you have all kinds of references and quotations of the Old Testament. You have everything about the Messiah, which is a big part of the Gospel's confession of Jesus. You have all of these quotations about Jesus as being a suffering Messiah, drawing heavily upon Isaiah for this particular interpretation. You have, especially in the Gospel of St. Matthew, you have all kinds of allusions and metaphors and quotations from the Old Testament as this is how it should have happened. But then, when we get to the bodily resurrection, all of those allusions and quotations cease in a very interesting silence. Even up to the crucifixion, you have references to the Old Testament. Even Jesus himself quotes the first line of Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So even the gospel writers themselves understand the allusions to Jesus' death, but all of a sudden when the resurrection of the body happens, all of those allusions to the Old Testament mysteriously fall silent. This is a really interesting thing, because what it points to is that the gospel writers actually recognize there's no precedent for what they're writing about. They actually recognize there's no precedent. There's nothing that they can really draw upon to say that, oh, this obviously was what needed to happen. But rather, when they fall silent, they're shifting to an eyewitness perspective. Eyewitnesses are simply saying what they experienced, what they saw, what they understood, and by very nature, eyewitnesses are going to have different interpretations on the same account. We see this in the Wittgenstein Popper story about differences as to how the interaction happened. However, one of the things that the New Testament is very clear about in all four Gospels is there are some really important similarities. Every single one of them has the tomb empty, and the stone is moved. Jesus' body is not there. They are very clear about this. Jesus' body is not in that tomb. And that in all of the Gospels, there is an interaction between a heavenly guest and some or most of the disciples. There is a particular experience that tells the disciples and the women at the tomb something has happened. That something is then sent out to then have them tell what exactly the messengers told them, or to have an interaction with Jesus directly themselves. But what needs to be said is that that tomb was empty, according to the Gospels. There's no getting around it. And that tomb was not only empty, but there was a messenger or messengers at that tomb that sent the women who witnessed it, and that also sent the disciples that came to look at the tomb back to then go and make sense of what just happened. And so, in that first bit of evidence, the falling silent completely of previous biblical allusions is not just not having any precedent for it, but the gospel writers having to simply say what the eyewitnesses say that they saw. The second strange thing about the confession of the Gospels is something very important to note historically and culturally. In the first century, and within the wider milieu of Jewish interpretations of the law, the testimony of women were not seen in some cases as admissible witness. We have evidences of the practice that it was not women's witness that counted. It was only the man's witness that counted. As it came to property rights, as it came to even simple things as selling of an ox for a certain amount of money, or even things as it comes to legal admission, that there had to be reliable witnesses. This is very, very clear in the law of Moses. But do you know what a really interesting fact about the resurrection of Jesus Christ is? Who were the people who were at the tomb? Who were what we would probably say, the primary witnesses to Jesus' resurrection, or at least to the empty tomb? They're women. All of them are. There's not a single man among them. Whether it's just Mary Magdalene in the Gospel of St. John who has this conversation with Jesus, whom she mistakes as the gardener, or whether it's the group of women who are going to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body for burial. They believe what they are doing is proper burial practice. And the thing is that every single one of them was a woman. To have this be the witness, the primary witnesses to the resurrection in the first century, is something that is remarkable about this story. Again, in our 21st century sort of perspective, this seems like something that is weird. In fact, sometimes people are tempted anachronistically to say, oh, well, you know, this is just an editorial remark from a later point of view. Except that why would a later edition of this story have the women be the first witnesses of this? Anybody who wrote a story, who was coming up with a story, would never use women as witnesses in the first century. Now, our modern sensibilities would see this as something that would be a possibility, but again, we have to shelve our modern sensibilities because that is an anachronism. That's not admissible evidence. Rather, what we have to say is what is the most likely explanation for what happened in the immediate context. It is just the case, in just as it might be, that women were not admissible witnesses in many cases. But the story of the Gospels, in every single Gospel, a woman or women were the primary witnesses, not the men. In fact, the women were the ones who went and told the men, the disciples who were not at the tomb, that Jesus has been raised, and they were told to come tell them. And guess what? Now you want something that is an injustice that the Gospels make very clear, and you want something to make real clear that this was a first century setting, is that it is said in more than one Gospel that the disciples treated what the women said as an idle tale. They didn't believe them. And again, culturally, that makes sense for the first century. That, again, no matter how unjust that is, that's just how the first century worked. But the remarkable thing about the Gospels is that the women were the witnesses. That's an unusual sort of move if you were trying to write this narratively, if you're writing this after the fact. And it points to, this is so unusual that you can't really conceive of a reason why someone would make a narrative choice if someone was merely making this story up. In other words, it has epistemological credibility, that this could actually be what happened. The third remarkable feature has to do with the way that the Gospels talk about Jesus himself in his anastasis. In Jesus' resurrection, in all of the Gospel accounts, you have a really fascinating thing that is happening. You have an embodied person, a discernible embodied person that has bodily functioning, just like a human would have, that eats food just like you'd expect a human would do, that has physical characteristics upon himself that can show to those who know him that this is actually Jesus. In other words, the marks of the crucifixion on his hands and his feet and his side, but that even the disciples don't understand or recognize him at first. There is a really interesting argument to be made about if the resurrection happened in the way that the Old Testament could have evidence given to. Wright would say it would more likely be the case that the writer of the experience of the resurrection would say that Jesus would have been shining like a star, as is a somewhat referential metaphor to the book of Daniel. The reason why this is important is because if the resurrection the anastasis, the bodily resurrection, was something that was relied upon merely by the Old Testament, you would not expect to witness, for lack of a better term, a completely normal experience of this person who was clearly dead. And the reason why this is really important is because the disciples know what ghosts are. They are very aware of what spirits are. But for the Gospels, especially for the Gospel of St. Luke and St. John, to have Jesus basically come to the disciples, and the disciples are scared out of their minds about who this might be. They're questioning in their hearts, even as they are worshiping him in a wonderful passage in St. Luke's Gospel. But Jesus basically looks at them and says, "You want breakfast? I'm making some fish right now," and he eats it in their presence. It's very intentional in the Gospel of St. John. He eats it. It's a bodily function. Jesus eats with his disciples. The road to Emmaus in St. Luke. He breaks bread with the disciples. He eats a meal with them. He is embodied. He is operating in this particular sense, but he also operates in some completely augmented senses, passing through doors that are locked, disappearing from sight, things like that. But one of the things that is remarkable about the New Testament's talking about Jesus is that it's bodily. It's bodily functioning in such a mundane fashion that the disciples are incredibly confused as to what exactly is going on. They're mystified. They're speechless. They don't know what to make of what they're witnessing. But again, the point of all of this is that every single gospel has this fascinating thing, that Jesus is an embodied person. This is inconceivable for someone in the 1st or 2nd century context to write about after the fact as if we're making this story up. You would not make this story up in this way because it would be ludicrous to the people who are your primary audience for these things. You would expect some sort of disembodied thing. You would expect some sort of thing that would be referential to Daniel of the resurrection of Jesus shining like a star and going up to be with God in heaven. You would never expect for a mundane experience of Jesus in an embodied form, in a physical, bodily functioning sort of form. That, you just wouldn't write that if you lived in the 1st century. And the 4th interesting thing is another interesting nuance to the Gospels themselves. Remember when Wright talked about this idea of the resurrection, the bodily resurrection of Jesus in the 1st century really didn't have to do with going to heaven when you die? Wright wants to point out that in the resurrection accounts of the New Testament, one of the things that is extremely obviously absent is any kind of connection with the future Christian hope. In other words, there is no interpretive spin on the Gospels of Jesus is raised, therefore we go to heaven when we die. Or Jesus is raised, and therefore the hope of the world is in our baptisms. That happens very, 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 very early after that. But in the eyewitness accounts in the Gospels, there is some level of speechlessness on account of the people who are talking about it. They have witnessed something that they don't know what it means. To be very honest, they witnessed something that they thought was impossible. And they're trying to make sense of it on the go, so to speak. The gospel writers are trying to make it very clear that there's no theological precedent for what just happened. In fact, it is so world-altering that Christians have to reflect and think and pray and wonder and go out and tell about what they have just witnessed, that it takes a bit of time before you have any interpretive lenses upon the resurrection of Christ. St. Paul, very, very, very early on, has a very, very clear interpretation of what Jesus's resurrection means for the future Christian hope. And Paul, of course, was taught by the disciples out of Jerusalem. And so the thing is that the disciples certainly had a good sense of what it meant as they further reflected upon what happened. But immediately in the Gospels themselves, at the resurrection accounts, nobody knew what it meant. All that they did know, though, is that something happened that they had a job to go tell about. The one command that Jesus gives when Jesus is sending out the disciples to go and be his witnesses is simply go and tell, baptize, and teach them to follow everything that I have commanded you. In other words, the disciples very simply are not given the interpretive key, at least explicitly within the Gospels, of what does Jesus' resurrection mean for the future. Rather, what they're given is that the resurrection has happened. Oh my goodness, we got to go tell people about this. That is a really interesting thing because, again, if you were someone who was trying to write this story after the fact from an imaginative standpoint, you would, by necessity, have some sort of gloss on the story that tells you what it means. But in the gospel accounts, you have no interpretive gloss. All that you have is that this is what happened. This is what the eyewitnesses have seen. This is what Jesus told us to do. Now we're gonna go and do it. Now we're gonna go tell people that something has happened. So you can see by the accounts of the Gospels themselves, we're dealing with something of an enigma in some ways. We don't have precedent for these types of stories. The story is told in such a way that if you were a writer in the 1st and 2nd century, it wouldn't make sense for you to write the story imaginatively with the details that are in here if you're wanting for things to be believable. And so, interestingly, paradoxically, that is also what lends credence to the fact that this might have actually been what actually happened, because this is such an unusual thing found and without precedent in the 1st century that no one would really be willing to put their name on the line of these things. And likewise, they wouldn't be willing to put their name out there as a witness to these things if they didn't rock solidly believe that something darn happened. So we have to take very seriously the uniqueness of what the New Testament says. And what we have just done is a part of this cumulative case argument. We have put forward what's called internal evidence. This is what the sources of the New Testament say internally about this particular happening that we are interrogating. This is internal evidence given by the Gospels to the credibility that the resurrection was a real historical event. But we also can give situatedness as to why these things are plausible in a wider historical sense. So the internal evidence of the Bible aside, we can also say that we have external evidence as to why we can say that this is a reliable, coherent, and in a lot of ways, accurate interpretation of an actual event that happened. So building the case from external evidence, what we have to say is, okay, the internal evidence that we have says very clearly something very unique. Now what we have to say is, what externally can we say from a general perspective also lends credence or disproves the internal evidence that may have been written by those who want to portray a story? I want to portray a particular story that has a particular meaning for a specific group of people and wouldn't necessarily be referring to a historical, real event. Well, Wright begins by saying, we have to remember in chapter 3 that the theological context comes in. We're building a cumulative case argument, so we are going to use some evidence that we've already talked about. First of all, when the disciples go to the tomb is empty. And when the disciples and the women at the tomb meet Jesus in various contexts, the one word that they use to describe Jesus is resurrection, anastasis. The thing is, though, if Jesus was just a spirit or a ghost, or if it was a spiritual experience, they would not have used the word resurrection. And go listen to chapter 3 as to why that would have been the case. But they would not have used the word resurrection. They know what resurrection means, and they would not have used it if it was a mere disembodied experience of Jesus. But an interesting thing about this is that we have to think about the tomb itself. Something that can easily get passed over is that internal evidence also points to an external practice that is a key aspect in what's happening, which is that Jesus' burial, the burial of Jesus, was according to a very specific practice. Remember in the Gospels, it is said that a disciple of Jesus named Joseph of Arimathea requests the body of Jesus and places Jesus' body in his own new tomb. Now, here is something very important to understand. Burial practice was a multi-step process in the first century. And this particular burial practice that is being referred to is an actual stepping process that is not simply a casket put in the ground. No, there were steps that happened that have to be followed in a certain pattern. First, you would take the body and you would wrap the body in spices and place the body on a shelf in a cave. A hewn tomb is what we see in this particular case. What is happening to the body of Jesus is that Joseph of Arimathea has placed the body of Jesus in a cave in which it is expected that the body is going to be wrapped in spices. Now remember, it was the Sabbath day. And so no touching of dead bodies, no work or anything was done on that day. And so it was late enough in the day that there was not a feasible way for that to be happening. And so what happened is that Jesus' body was simply taken, placed in the tomb for later, so that, as we see in the internal accounts, as what we would perfectly expect in the first century, the women would come with the spices and the burial wrappings to wrap the body. This is exactly what we see in the New Testament. And then after the body is wrapped in those spices and placed on the shelf in the cave, they would basically wait until the flesh decomposed. They would wait until nature took its course, and all of the burial spices would, take care of the stink, things like that. And then at a later point in time, the loved ones or the people who knew the person would come, gather the bones of the body and place it in an ossuary or a bone box. This would be especially the case of important people, where their bones would be kept in a particular place of final burial. They would not be simply thrown out the door or buried in the ground or things like that. There was a specific practice that is referenced in the Gospels that is a practice of the first century. Now, what you can see, though, is that this process got interrupted at a really key point. The women had not wrapped the body yet. And if they had wrapped the body, and if it had been decomposing and things like that, and if the disciples all of a sudden said, hey, Jesus has been resurrected, you could simply go and find the ossuary where Jesus's bones had been kept. If it was written after the fact, you would, in a very real way, produce the body. And so you would produce evidence that Jesus was not bodily raised in an anastasis. But think about when that process gets interrupted, though. The women weren't even able to get to the body fast enough for them to wrap it in spices. Rather, Jesus was gone by the time that the women got there. And not only was he gone, but as the angels at the tomb said, he is no longer here. He has been raised like he said he was going to be. In other words, the body got up and left. Jesus stood back up and left. And so the internal evidence of the burial practice is actually very strong evidence that it is absolutely plausible that when they went to the tomb, they're not looking at a final burial spot. They're looking at an interstitial spot before Jesus' bones are placed in an ossuary. The problem is, in a funny way, is that the disciples and the women were too slow. They couldn't get to Jesus before he was resurrected on the third day. And that fits with the way that the burial practice is described in the Gospels. This is a perfectly admissible piece of historical evidence in this particular case that is an external evidence. This is what burial practices looked like in the first century, and therefore that is admissible evidence that something interrupted the process of burial. But a further piece of external evidence has to do with modern psychology, and it has to do with the concept of cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance, very simply, is that one wishes for something to be the case or reality that is simply not met by reality itself. There is a cognitive dissonance between what we really wish happens and what actually happens in the world. Now, this is a very, very elementary sort of way of describing that. Psychologists out there can give you much better explanation than I can. But one of the things that Wright points out is that the theory of cognitive dissonance, of the disciples wishing so hard, just so hard, that Jesus actually was raised from the dead, is that, well, we have writings from the New Testament that are written by insiders that are wishing so hard for Jesus to be the fulfillment and Messiah that he was supposed to be, that in their witness, they simply chose, despite evidence to the contrary, to believe something in spite of all evidence. So that's a theory that gets put forward. There are, again, external evidences that you can point towards in particular case studies that can say, well, this clearly can happen. Someone can believe something so hard that even all of reality cannot convince the person otherwise. We can point to that. The problem with this, though, is that when you come to the New Testament, even the Bible says the disciples were not expecting anything like the anastasis. Go back to chapter 3 again. The disciples understood everything Jesus was talking about when he referred to the kingdom of heaven. They had no problem with the fact that he was the Messiah. They had no issue with what the kingdom of heaven meant, of God's kingdom breaking in. They knew in their heritage as Jews what that meant. They could talk that language. But absolutely none of them, absolutely zero of them, were expecting an anastasis of Jesus, a bodily resurrection in time, and not merely at the end of the age. For the theory of cognitive dissonance in this case to work, the disciples would have had to have so hard believed that Jesus was bodily raised that they simply convinced themselves of that prior to evidence to the contrary. But the issue with this becomes obvious, right? No Jew was expecting this anastasis to happen in time. None of even Jesus' own disciples thought that this was going to happen to Jesus. And so it's a strange thing to put forward as cognitive dissonance, which is a real thing. It's not that this is not real. It's just that in this particular case, that doesn't seem to fit the cumulative case narrative. There are pieces of evidence that seem to point to a different narrative conclusion. And where it falls apart, at least in Wright's argument, is that cognitive dissonance only can be admissible evidence if it is rock solidly the case that the disciples wanted a certain outcome and knew what the outcome they wanted was. It is simply the case, historically, that the disciples who were Jewish, who believed in the bodily resurrection at the end of the age, would simply not have been looking for a bodily resurrection to happen in time.